With over 2,000 steam locomotives preserved in America, it would be fair to say that we have quite enough to keep the preservation movement going. However, some classes weren't as lucky as others. Such engines were either meant for preservation and then scrapped by mistake, or simply forgotten about altogether, swept up in the onslaught of dieselization. From famous speed demons to underrated heavy haulers, I'm going to count down the top 15 extinct American steam locomotives. Number 15. The Pennsylvania Railroad S1 6446, number 6100. This unique locomotive was built by the Pennsylvania Railroad's Juniata shops in 1939, and the elegant streamlining was dreamed up by famed industrial designer Raymond Loewy. The S1 had a strange wheel arrangement of 6446 with 84-inch diameter driving wheels and an astonishing length of over 146 feet. It's no wonder that it was nicknamed the Big Engine. After being displayed at the 1939 New York World's Fair, the S1 was used on the PRR's main line between Chicago, Illinois and Crestline, Ohio, pulling deluxe passenger trains. Unfortunately, like most of PRR's later duplex locomotive designs, the S1 was susceptible to wheel slip, as half of its overall weight was on the driving wheels, with the pilot and trailing trucks bearing the rest of it. Plus, its large size limited its route availability, thus the reason why it only ran between Chicago and Crestline. After 7 years in service, S1 number 6100 was formally retired in 1946 and unceremoniously scrapped 3 years later. A rather quiet end for the Big Engine. Well, at least we have the Lionel and MTH models to keep the legend alive. Number 14. The Norfolk & Western's Y6b. Now, before I mention this class, I know some of you will mention number 2156 from the Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, and now on loan to the Virginia Museum of Transportation in Roanoke. The difference is that 2156 is a Y6a, not a Y6b. The latter engines were longer, had larger fireboxes, and a greater tractive effort. To use 2156 as an example, it is rated for 166,000 horsepower, whereas the Y6Bs had 170,000. At 25 miles per hour, the Y6Bs had equal horsepower as the Union Pacific's big boys. So if you wanted a heavy hauler that could slug it out on grades, N&W had the engine for the job. Unfortunately, almost all the Y6Bs were scrapped when the Norfolk & Western gave up steam in 1960. However, one engine, number 2174, almost made it into preservation. After being used on a farewell to steam excursion in July of 1959, it was sold to a scrapyard in Roanoke, where it sat until 1976. The Roanoke chapter of the National Railway Historical Society made an attempt to save the locomotive, but the head of the fundraising project passed away, and when the deadline came and went, the 2174 was sadly caught up. It's a shame that a Y6b got away before preservationists had the chance to save it, but it's gratifying to know that we still have Y6a number 2156 around to complete the link in the chain of Roanoke's Big Three. Number 13. The Erie and Virginian triplexes. In the 19-teens, the articulated locomotive was starting to make a big impact on American railroading. The Erie and Virginian railroads knew that if they wanted a locomotive that could haul heavy trains up steep grades, they would have to go big or go home. So in 1914, the Erie purchased the first 28882 triplex locomotive from the Baldwin Locomotive Works. Number 5014, the Matt H. Shea, was a monster of an engine with a 210 psi boiler, 3 sets of 8 driving wheels, and a tractive effort of 160,000 pounds. Unfortunately, the Matt H. Shea didn't perform that well in service, as the firebox, which had a grate area of 90 square feet, was found to be too small. Stories persist that the locomotive frequently ran out of steam on Gulf Summit grade, and trains would have to stop for several minutes in order to have the engine get its boiler pressure back up. Thankfully, the Matt H. Shea was rebuilt with a larger firebox with 122 square feet of grade area. Sadly, this didn't stop the other factor that plagued it and the PRR duplex engines that would come decades later: wheel slip. As coal and water were used up from the tender, the rear set of driving wheels was prone to slipping. However, since the locomotives were mainly used in helper service, their fuel and water supplies were readily replenished after each run up the hills. The Erie went on to order 2 additional triplexes, while the Virginian ordered only 1, with a 28884 wheel arrangement. Sadly, though, all 4 engines were later deemed unsuccessful and either sold for scrap or cut into 2 separate locomotives, which was the fate of the Virginian engine. So the triplex lives on in American railroad history as a big gamble that ended up becoming a big bust. Number 12. The Southern Pacific AC-9s. These gigantic articulated engines were the oddballs of the SP fleet. The cab forwards had proven their worth to the railroad, but they wanted a locomotive that could work in the southern portion of the system, between New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona. So in 1939, Lima Locomotive Works built 12 28884s for use on heavy freight trains in this region. They originally burned coal, but were converted to oil in the 1950s, which increased their route availability. They were also partially streamlined, having borrowed the skyline casing from the famous GS-class Northerns used in passenger service. Unfortunately, after dieselization of the southwestern divisions and a final stand on the Modoc line in Nevada and California, the big reverse cab forwards were retired between 1953 and 1956, and then sent to the scrapyard. Honestly, this is one articulated engine I would have liked to have seen preserved. It just has a style about it that's different to many of the others. Maybe it has to do with that skyline casing, but that's just me. Number 11. The Pennsylvania J1 and the Chesapeake and Ohio T1 210-4s. I decided to include both of these engines together in this spot since the development of one of these 2 giants led to the development of another. Let's break down the history lesson. In the early 1930s, the Chesapeake and Ohio was looking for a locomotive for freight service. So they turned to the new Advisory Mechanical Committee, or AMC, which also managed the motive power designs for the Nickel Plate, the Erie, and the Père Marquette. The C&O tested the Erie's 284 Berkshires and decided they wanted an additional pair of driving wheels for their engine, creating a 210-4. The T1s arrived from Lima Locomotive Works, and the class numbered 40 in all. In service, they were used for heavy coal drags between Russell, Kentucky and Toledo, Ohio, as well as in Virginia. Fast forward to the 1940s, and the Pennsylvania Railroad was looking for another heavy locomotive to haul freight trains, but wartime restrictions denied the PRR the opportunity to build a new engine from the rails up. In light of the situation, the railroad tested a Norfolk and Western Class A and a C&O T1 to see which one was the better performer. In the end, the T1 proved to be the overall superior engine to base a design from. So between 1942 and 1943, the Juniata shops turned out an impressive 125 of the PRR's own 210-4s, known as the J1s. Eventually, both classes succumbed to the rise of diesel power, with the C&O engines disappearing first between 1952 and 1953. The J1s followed their predecessors to oblivion 5 years later. Number 10. The New Haven I-5 Class 464s. These beautiful, streamlined Hudsons were built by Baldwin Locomotive Works in 1937 for the New Haven, and became famous for their fleet-footed work hauling the railroad's named express passenger trains, such as the Merchants Limited and the Yankee Clipper. Only 10 of these engines were ever built, but crews and passengers loved them for their speed and their style. One interesting note is that the locomotive streamlining was designed by another famous Art Deco designer, Otto Kohler. Sadly, their time in service didn't last very long, as the New Haven began purchasing diesels after World War II. All of the magnificent I-5s were retired from the roster by 1951, and subsequently scrapped. However, the famed Australian Class C-38 Pacific No. 3801 carries on the I-5's streamlined styling in the land down under, so it would be fair to say that a part of the New Haven legacy lives on abroad. Number 9. The Milwaukee Road F7 464s and Class A 442s. The Milwaukee Road's Hiawatha is undeniably one of the most famous streamlined passenger trains in American railroading. And what would a beautiful train be without beautiful locomotives to pull them? When the service was inaugurated in the 1930s, the Milwaukee Road introduced 4 Class A Atlantics, which had 84-inch driving wheels and rated for a top speed of over 100 miles per hour. Many stories are told of the Class A engines trying to reach the world steam speed record, and getting very close, but not before Mallard took the crown in 1938. Meanwhile, the Milwaukee Road ordered more locomotives to pull the Hiawathas. 6 F7 464s arrived in 1937 and 1938, supplementing the Class A 442s very nicely. As was the case with the I-5s on the New Haven, both of the Milwaukee's streamlined engines were designed by Otto Kohler. And just like the I-5s, when the diesels replaced them on the Hiawathas, there was no going back for the F7s and the Class A's. By 1953, all 10 of these engines were withdrawn and cut up. Number 8. The Florida East Coast 482s. The 482 Mountain type was a versatile locomotive that served many railroads well, including the Florida East Coast. The railroad that went to sea bought 125 Mountain-type engines from Alco between 1923 and 1926. Unfortunately, the Great Depression put a serious dent in the FEC's finances, and the once proud railroad declared bankruptcy in the early 1930s. In what seems to be a move to recoup some of their financial losses, the Florida East Coast sold off 50 of their 482s to other railroads, including the Western Railway of Alabama, the St. Louis Southwestern, better known as the Cotton Belt, and the National Railways of Mexico. The rest of the Florida East Coast 482s hung on in regular service, with a few being involved in wrecks or boiler explosions, until the early 1950s, when all of them were retired. Number 7. The Western Maryland J1 484s. The Western Maryland Railroad was well known for its consolidations and challengers for heavy freight service, but they also had 12 484s on their roster. Baldwin Locomotive Works built these engines and delivered them to the Wild Mary in 1947. Instead of calling them Northerns, however, the Western Maryland decided to name their engines Potomacs. They earned the distinction of being some of the last 484s built new for any railroad in the country, and made their mark hauling freight trains in tandem with the M2 class Challengers. Unfortunately, as was the case with most modern steam locomotives, the Potomacs didn't last very long in service before diesels came along. All the engines were retired in May of 1954, and then scrapped 3 years later when the equipment trusts expired. Though there are several other Northern-type engines preserved, including the rival Reading T1s, it's kinda sad that none of the Potomacs were saved, as they would have made a nice contrast to some of the other 484s that were restored. But one can dream. Number 6. The Baltimore and Ohio EM1s. The Baltimore and Ohio is known for being the first official railroad incorporated in America on July 4, 1828. It was also known for having some impressive motive power, from the P-Class 462s and the antique locomotive collection, including the Thatcher Perkins and the William Mason. After World War II, the B&O ordered 30 2884 locomotives for heavy freight service. The EM1 class locomotives quickly proved their worth in freight work, and with their roller bearings, they were also quite adept for working fast mail and express trains as well. The EM1s originally served the Cumberland Division, home of the infamous Sand Patch and 17-mile grades. Later, as diesels took over that territory, the locomotives were transferred to the Pittsburgh Division. By 1957, though, scrapping commenced on the fleet, and by 1960, all of them were gone. Or were they? A post on a Baltimore and Ohio Facebook fan page recently shows an old B&O museum booklet from the late 1950s and early 1960s that highlights a future exhibit being an EM1. The following pictures in the post show engine number 659 in dead storage, awaiting the chance to be put on display. Tragically, there was possibly a mix-up in communication regarding the locomotive's status, and the 659 didn't live to see preservation, being cut up by 1961. A sad case of close, but no cigar for these Baltimore and Ohio brutes. Number 5. The Reading and CNJ 462s. These two classes of Pacifics deserve to be together in this spot, as they were the backbone of express passenger service for their respective railroads. The Reading G-Class engines were built in two batches. The first 30, known as Class G1SA, in the Reading's own workshops between 1916 and 1922, and an additional 5, known as Class G2SA, being built by Baldwin in 1924. Then, in 1948, the Reading shops built 10 more engines in the Class G3. The Central Railroad of New Jersey saw how much of a success that the Reading engines were, and decided to order several identical locomotives for their own roster from Baldwin. The CNJ's own G-Class Pacifics became the cream of the crop for their deluxe passenger train, the Blue Comet, which ran between Jersey City and Atlantic City in the 1920s and 1930s. The engines were painted blue and cream to match the heavyweight consist. The Reading's G-Class was also well known for being flashy engines, as 2 of them were streamlined in the late 1930s to pull the stainless steel Crusader passenger train, which ran from Philadelphia to Jersey City. Sadly, the 2 breeds of Pacifics were later downgraded to secondary passenger services as diesels took over the high-priority assignments. The CNJ engines were retired by 1955, and the Reading engines followed them 2 years later. Number 4. The PRR T1 4444 Duplex. You should have known this one was coming. The famed T1 duplex locomotives, built by Baldwin Locomotive Works and the PRR in the early and mid-1940s. These shark-nosed giants were developed to be the next generation of steam passenger locomotives. But just like the S1 before it, the T1s were prone to violent wheel slips, which were compounded by the finicky nature of the poppet valve gear. Regardless of those problems, though, they could attain 80 to 100 miles per hour quite easily, and were used between Harrisburg and St. Louis. After a few years of working the famous first-class passenger trains of the Pennsy, the T1s were relegated to mail and express service after the EMD, E7, and E8 diesels came into the picture. All of them were retired by 1952, and later scrapped 4 years later. But all hope isn't lost for the T1 duplex. In the spring of 2014, a group of railroad preservation experts formed the PRR T1 Steam Locomotive Trust, with the intent of building a brand new T1 from the rails up. At the time of this production, they have a campaign on Kickstarter which is winding down for getting the driving wheel castings made. The campaign has raised just over its goal of $20,000. While some enthusiasts might be opposed to the idea of building a new T1, the opportunity for new build mainline steam is there. After all, if the British can build a new Pacific from the rails up, we can do it too. The new T1, to be numbered 5550, is expected to be completed by the year 2030. Number 3. The New York Central's, Hudsons, and Niagaras. These two engines are grouped together in this spot because they're both highly respected icons of the New York Central Railroad. The Hudsons were first developed by the New York Central in the mid-1920s as a response to longer and heavier passenger trains straining the limits of their K5 class Pacific-type engines. The first Hudson rolled out of Alco's Schenectady Works in 1927, and from that point onward, they just kept rolling out of the factory until 1938, when the last ones were completed. All told, a staggering 275 J-class Hudsons were built for the water-level route. The locomotives proved their worth, keeping to time with the railroad's top express passenger assignments, such as the 20th Century Limited and the Empire State Express. Some engines were later streamlined to match their stylish trains, which ran from New York State to Chicago. Later on in the 1940s, the New York Central expanded their steam passenger roster with 27 484s that they called Niagaras. They complemented the Hudsons really well in express passenger service, and later helped to haul some fast freights, including the famed pacemakers. As good as these engines were, however, the New York Central was hell-bent on diesel supremacy by the early 1950s. By the end of the decade, none of the Hudsons or Niagaras were left to savor the joys of preservation. Several attempts have been made to try and build a new J-class Hudson, but the projects have stalled in one way or another. One can only hope that a new Hudson will eventually be built in the not-too-distant future. Number 2. The Central of Georgia's Big Apples. These 484s are some of the rarest locomotives to have ever worked in the southern United States. They were built by Lima Locomotive Works in 1943, during the height of World War II. But, just as the War Production Board had prohibited the Pennsylvania from building a new locomotive from the rails up, they did the same for the Central of Georgia. With that restriction, the COG based their new 484s off of the Southern Pacific GS2s, built in the late 1930s. You can see the GS2's design influence in the box-pock driving wheels and running gear, but in every other respect, they were Central of Georgia's own design. The tender seemed small compared to the locomotive, but the Big Apples lived up to their reputation as good engines on the railroad. The 8 engines in this group of 484s enjoyed a 10-year career hauling passenger and freight trains between Birmingham, Alabama and Atlanta, Georgia. By 1953, however, all of them were retired and scrapped in favor of diesel power. Now before we get to number 1, I would like to include some honorable mentions for this list. And now for the number 1 pick. Every steam turbine locomotive. If there was ever a curiosity in railroad history that deserves to be admired, even in the twilight of the steam era, it has to be the steam turbine locomotives. Beginning in the 1930s, America's railroads thought, what if we took the turbine power concept that power plants and ships use and apply it to locomotives? And so, in 1939, General Electric partnered with the Union Pacific to produce the first steam turbine electric locomotives. Yes, despite having the outward appearance of a diesel, these engines were in fact powered by steam. Despite having successful test runs, they broke down once while hauling a passenger train from Colorado to Omaha, necessitating a conventional steam locomotive to come to their aid. By 1941, the Union Pacific had pulled out of the partnership, and the engines were leased to the Great Northern for freight service. In late 1943, the locomotives were returned to GE and scrapped before the end of World War II. Around the time GE's steam turbines were being scrapped, the Pennsylvania Railroad experimented with their own direct-drive steam turbine. The odd 686 locomotive, S2 class number 6200, was built by Baldwin Locomotive Works in 1944. It had 2 Westinghouse designed and built turbines, one for forward running and one for backward running. It was used for passenger trains between Chicago and Crestline, Ohio, much like the S1 duplex before it. The PRR gave the S2 a lot of publicity, but it ended up being an operational nightmare. It had stable problems relating to the boiler pressure dropping rapidly, due to the turbines using up massive amounts of steam. After only 2 years in service, the 6200 was removed from service and stored at Crestline until 1952, when it was moved to Conway, Pennsylvania, and cut up. But the turbine story doesn't end here. Baldwin and Westinghouse also built 3 steam turbine electrics for the Chesapeake and Ohio's Chessie Streamliner. The M1 class turbines were rated at 6,000 horsepower and were predicted to run from Washington to Cincinnati and back without any servicing. But like the 2 previous turbines, they suffered continuous mechanical maladies. The Chessie Streamliner was cancelled by 1948, essentially making the M1 class worthless. In 1950, all 3 engines were unceremoniously scrapped. The final steam turbine of note is the Norfolk & Western's number 2300, affectionately known as the John Henry. It was built by Baldwin in May of 1954, and though it had a fair rate of success, it had minor problems as far as boiler controls were concerned. and it was too big and too late to save the age of steam. It was retired by the beginning of 1958 and was no more. So all of these turbines might have had a chance if they had been allowed to develop further, but their early teething troubles and the rise of diesel power ultimately sealed their fate. The one-of-a-kind design of these engines and their short-lived lives are the main reasons why they deserve the #1 spot on this list of extinct American steam locomotives. That's all for this list, but if you like this video, be sure to leave a comment and a rating. And be sure to stay tuned for more new content coming to my channel in the not-too-distant future. So until next time, I wish you all good night, good luck, and keep on steaming.